Hey there, prodigal teens. Pastor Chris here, coming to you on a Friday afternoon. Hope you're doing well. And I am reading out of Acts chapter 5. We're continuing our mini devotional series here. And today we're reading maybe the strangest story in all of Acts. It's one of my favorites, just because it's absolutely weird and insane. And so we're just going to jump into it here. We talked last week about Peter and John yesterday, about Peter and John and them being questioned in front of the Sanhedrin. And now we're going to look at some of the inner workings of the church here. Now, the church is totaling about 500 people or so, not super big, not super huge, but still an important movement in the Roman culture at the time. And so we're going to see how the church deals with some interesting discipline issues. But let's read. I'm starting in chapter 5, verse 1 here. Now a man named Ananias, together with his wife Sapphira, also sold a piece of property. With his wife's full knowledge, he kept back part of the money for himself, but brought the rest and put it at the apostles' feet. Then Peter said, Ananias, how is it that Satan has so filled your heart that you have lied to the Holy Spirit and have kept for yourself some of the money you received for the land? Didn't it belong to you before it was sold? And after it was sold, wasn't the money at your disposal? What made you think of doing such a thing? You have not lied to just human beings, but to God. When Ananias heard this, he fell down and died. A great fear seized all those who heard what had happened. Then some young men came forward, wrapped up his body, and carried him off to bury him. About 3 hours later, his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. Peter asked her, tell me, is this the price you and Ananias paid for the land? Yes, she said, this is the price. Peter also said to her, how could you conspire to test the Spirit of the Lord? Listen, the feet of the men who hauled your husband away are at the door, and they will carry you off also. At that moment she fell down at his feet and died. Then the young men came in, and finding her dead, carried her away and buried her beside her husband. Great fear seized the whole church and all those who had heard about these events. Okay, so some context before we dig into this, because it's a strange scene. The church was, a lot of the disciples in the church at the time were taking the property they had, selling it, and then giving all the money to the church and laying it at the apostles' feet here. And so Ananias and Sapphira, they become believers. They come in, and they have this great idea. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to sell our property, and we're going to give the money to the church. But somewhere in this transaction, Ananias decides, you know what? I don't want to give all of this money, but I want it to look like I've given all of this money. So I'm going to tell Peter that this is all the money I got for the land, and then everything will be fine. He won't know the difference. He won't know whether or not I'm lying. And then we have these great death scenes here where Peter asks these questions, and then they drop dead instantly. It's terrifying. It's awful. And so, yeah, it's a interesting scene. And like I said, great fear seized the church after this as well. This seems, at first read, like a horrific event that happens. And like, why would anyone want to follow a religion where you have to sell all of your property, and then if you don't give all of the money to the church, you die instantly, right? That seems like a religion that is not worth following. And if we read it just on that surface cursory level, it can sure seem like the apostles are pretty cruel, and like this religion isn't worth hanging around. But we have to understand that Ananias didn't die because he kept some of the money back, right? That wasn't what Peter charged him with. Instead, he charged him with lying to the Holy Spirit and lying to God about the amount of money he received for it. See, I firmly believe that had Ananias said, you know what, here is part of the money that we received for selling it, but we don't want to give all of the money. We're just going to give this part to Peter. Then they would have been fine, and nothing bad would have happened. But in the act of going, you know what, we want it to look like we're better than we are. We want it to look like we're more important or better followers of the way than we really are. So we're just going to say, you know what, this was all the money, and that's it. In doing that, in creating that lie, they set themselves up as uh, very prideful, very arrogant, and it's those sins, it's that reason that they die here. It is not because they kept a portion of the money back, but because they lied about keeping a portion of the money back. And again, you see, when Sapphira comes to Peter, she doesn't die because she doesn't give up the money. She dies because Peter asks her point blank, was this all the money? And when she says, yes, it was, that's when she dies there too as well. This is also should not be taken as a lesson of like, well, if you lie to the church or you lie to me, God's just going to make you drop dead. That's horrifying. That's crazy. This is obviously an extreme, over-the-top example of something like this happening. But it just really goes to show the dedication of the early church and what they were willing to tolerate and what they weren't willing to tolerate. And what they weren't willing to tolerate were people who were going to pretend to follow a way that was not really how they were acting. And had they been honest, had they been open, this probably wouldn't have happened. So I hope you're doing well. That's it for me today. That's it for me this week. I will see you guys on Monday, and take care of yourselves. Until then.